You stopped feeling things the way you used to. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like color draining from a photograph you didn't know was fading. You wake up, you function, you go through the motions, but somewhere deep inside, something has gone silent. You're alive, but you're not living. You're breathing, but you're not present. And the most terrifying part, you've learned to accept it. You've made peace with the numbness because feeling nothing is easier than feeling everything. But Ibn Arabi, the 12th century Sufi mystic who spent his life mapping the terrain of the soul, said something that should disturb you. What you call death is not the end. It's the signal. The soul doesn't die randomly. It dies because you've been feeding it the wrong things, breathing the wrong air, and living in a state that suffocates what is real inside you. And if you can feel that deadness, if you can name it, then you're closer to awakening than you think, because the soul only goes silent when it's preparing to speak in a language you've forgotten how to hear. This video is not for people who want to feel better. It's for people who are willing to feel true. And if you're still here, then something in you knows. You didn't come here to be comforted. You came here because you're ready to remember what it means to be alive. Let's begin with what you're not being told. The spiritual teachers, the self-help voices, the meditation apps, they all promise you peace, clarity, awakening, as if these are destinations you arrive at by following 10 steps and practicing gratitude. But Ibn Arabi didn't teach destinations. He taught dissolution. He taught that the thing you call you is the very reason your soul feels dead. Because the soul doesn't belong to the self you've constructed. It belongs to something far older, far vaster, and far more real than the identity you've been defending your entire life. The self you wake up as, the one you introduce to others, the one you see in the mirror. That's not your soul. That's your nafs. And according to Ibn Arabi, your nafs is a veil, a mask made of fear, ambition, shame, pride, and endless need. It's the part of you that constantly asks, am I enough? Am I safe? Am I seen? And every time you feed that voice, every time you live for its approval, your soul grows quieter, because the soul doesn't speak the language of survival. It speaks the language of truth, and truth in the world you've built around yourself is suffocating. Ibn Arabi taught that most human beings live their entire lives without ever meeting their own soul. They live in the nafs, mistaking its desires for their own, its fears for reality, its stories for who they are. And the soul? It watches, it waits, it grows silent, not because it's weak, but because it cannot compete with the noise of the ego. The nafs is loud, it demands, it justifies, it defends, it performs. The soul is quiet. It doesn't argue, it doesn't convince, it simply knows. And when you spend years ignoring what knows in favor of what wants, the soul does something that feels like death. It withdraws. This is not a metaphor. This is a spiritual diagnosis. You feel dead inside because the part of you that is truly alive has stopped trying to reach you. It has gone into a kind of hibernation, a protective silence, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to breathe again. And those conditions, Ibn Arabi said, require one thing that most people will never choose willingly: the death of the nafs. Not its improvement, not its healing, its death. Let that sit with you for a moment. The reason you feel dead is because you haven't died yet. Not in the way that matters. You're still clinging to the illusion of who you think you are, and that illusion is draining every ounce of life from your soul. Ibn Arabi called this state the nafs al-ammara, the commanding soul, the soul that is enslaved to its impulses, its fears, its endless need for validation and control. And this is where most people live their entire lives, in a constant state of inner tyranny, ruled by a self that doesn't even know it's not real. But here's what breaks people open: suffering, loss, heartbreak, failure. The moments when the self you've built can no longer hold itself together. Ibn Arabi didn't see these moments as punishments. He saw them as mercy, because suffering is the only thing powerful enough to crack the shell of the nafs. When everything you thought you were falls apart, when the identity you spent years defending collapses, when you lose the things you thought made you real, that's when the soul can finally breathe. Not because suffering is good, but because it reveals the lie. It shows you that the self you were protecting wasn't you at all. And in that revelation, something stirs, something you forgot was there. something that doesn't need the world's permission to exist. Ibn Arabi called this stirring the first pull. It's the moment the soul begins to remember, not through thought, not through belief, but through a feeling so subtle that most people miss it entirely. It's a restlessness, a longing, a quiet, persistent sense that something is missing, that you're not where you're supposed to be, that there's a depth to existence you've been living on the surface of. You might feel it in moments of silence, in the middle of the night when you can't sleep, when you're surrounded by people but feel utterly alone, when you achieve something you thought you wanted and feel nothing. That's not depression. That's your soul trying to get your attention. But here's the trap. The nafs, when it senses this pull, does everything it can to drown it out. It distracts you, it creates new projects, new ambitions, new dramas, new relationships, new identities to chase. It floods your mind with noise because it knows, on some unconscious level, that if you actually listen to that pull, if you follow it, you will have to let go of the person you think you are. And the nafs cannot survive that. So it fights, it resists. It convinces you that the longing is weakness, that the silence is dangerous, that you need to stay busy, stay productive, stay in control. And this is where most awakenings die, not because the soul gave up, but because the person chose the familiar prison over the unknown freedom. Ibn Arabi taught that the soul only awakens when the nafs is exhausted, when it has tried everything, controlled everything, defended everything, and finally, inevitably, failed, because the nafs cannot win. It can only delay. And every delay, every resistance, every refusal to feel what's real makes the soul's silence deeper. Until one day, you look in the mirror and you don't recognize yourself. Not because you've changed, but because you finally see what you've been avoiding. You've been living someone else's life. You've been performing a role you didn't choose. You've been breathing air that wasn't meant for you. And now finally the question arrives, what do I do? Here's what Ibn Arabi would say. Stop trying to fix yourself. Stop trying to improve the self that's killing you. Stop looking for techniques, practices, and strategies to make the nafs more comfortable. Because the soul doesn't awaken through comfort. It awakens through surrender. And surrender is not a practice, it's a collapse. It's the moment you stop holding yourself together and allow what's false to fall away. It's the moment you admit, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what's real. And in that admission, in that raw, undefended honesty, the soul begins to breathe again. Ibn Arabi called this process fana, annihilation, the death of the constructed self. And it doesn't happen once. It happens in layers, in stages, in a gradual dismantling of everything you thought was solid. He described 7 stages of fana, each one deeper than the last, each one stripping away another mask, another defense, another lie you told yourself about who you are. And at each stage, the question is the same. Are you willing to let go? Most people aren't. They taste the edge of fana and retreat. They feel the ground beneath them start to dissolve, and they grab for something, anything to hold on to. They rebuild the self in a new form, more spiritual, more awakened, more enlightened, but still fundamentally the same. Still a mask, still a defense against what's real. And the soul, once again, goes silent. But if you don't retreat, if you let the dissolution happen, if you allow the self to die without trying to resurrect it in a new costume, something emerges that has no name. Ibn Arabi called it baqa, subsistence in God, the state of being that remains when the illusion is gone. It's not a new self. It's not an improved version of who you were. It's what was always there, underneath the noise, underneath the fear, underneath the endless performance of identity. It's the breath that breathes you, the awareness that watches your thoughts, the presence that exists whether you notice it or not. And here's what changes. Nothing and everything. You still live in the world. You still have responsibilities, relationships, challenges, pain. But you're no longer drowning in them. There's a part of you that remains untouched, steady, clear, a space inside that doesn't collapse when things fall apart. Ibn Arabi said that after fana, after the ego dies, you begin to see that everything that happens is a message, not a punishment, not a test, but a revelation. Every experience, every emotion, every moment of suffering or joy is the divine speaking in the only language the soul understands, direct experience. But you can only hear that language after you've stopped listening to the nafs, after you've stopped believing its stories about who you are and what you need, after you've stopped living in fear of not being enough. Because the soul doesn't need to be enough. It already is, it always was. Let's go deeper. Because most people, even when they understand this intellectually, still live in the nafs. They read about fana, they meditate on surrender, they talk about ego death, but they never actually die, they never actually let go. Why? Because they're waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right level of readiness. But Ibn Arabi said, there is no right moment, the moment is always now, and the conditions are always imperfect, and you will never feel ready, because readiness is just another strategy of the nafs to delay its own death. The soul awakens the moment you stop waiting for permission, the moment you stop asking if you're doing it right, the moment you stop looking for signs, for teachers, for validation, the moment you realize that no one can do this for you. No teacher, no practice, no book, no video. They can point, they can reflect, but the dying has to happen inside you, in the raw, unwitnessed privacy of your own soul. And it won't look the way you think. It won't feel noble or holy or enlightened. It will feel like falling, like losing, like being completely, utterly lost, and that's exactly where you need to be, because the soul doesn't awaken in certainty. It awakens in surrender. It awakens when you finally stop trying to control the journey and you just let go. You let the self fall apart. You let the identity dissolve. You let the fear come, and instead of running from it, you breathe through it. You let the grief come, and instead of numbing it, you feel it. You let the silence come, and instead of filling it with noise, you listen. And slowly, so slowly you almost don't notice, something begins to change. The deadness you felt starts to lift. Not because you fixed yourself, but because you stopped trying to. Not because you became someone new, but because you stopped pretending to be someone you're not. The soul doesn't need to be awakened. It needs to be freed. And it can only be freed when the prison of the nafs is dismantled. Ibn Arabi said that the soul is like a mirror. When it's covered in dust, fear, desire, ambition, identity, it can't reflect the light. But when the dust is wiped away, when the nafs is dissolved, the mirror becomes clear. And what it reflects is not you. It's the divine, the source of all existence, the breath that sustains you, the presence that has been with you since before you were born and will remain long after you're gone. This is what it means to awaken. Not to become enlightened, not to transcend the world, not to escape suffering, but to see clearly, to recognize what's real and what's illusion, to live from the soul instead of the nafs, to breathe with the breath of God instead of the shallow gasps of fear. And here's the paradox that breaks minds. The soul was never asleep. You were. The soul was never dead. You were. You were living in a dream, a constructed reality where the nafs convinced you it was real, and the soul waited patiently for you to wake up. And now, if you're reading this, if these words are landing somewhere inside you, then the waiting is over. Not because you've arrived, but because you've finally stopped running. Let's talk about what happens in the body. Because this isn't just philosophy. This isn't abstract mysticism floating in some intangible realm. Ibn Arabi was obsessed with the body, with breath, with the physical experience of being alive. He taught that the soul doesn't just exist in some spiritual dimension separate from your flesh. It lives in your breath, in the rhythm of your lungs, in the pulse of your heart. He said that every breath you take is a conversation with the divine. Every inhale is God giving you life. Every exhale is you returning it. But you've stopped listening to your breath. You breathe mechanically, unconsciously, barely enough to survive. And because the breath is the bridge between body and soul, when your breath becomes shallow, your connection to the soul becomes shallow too. Ibn Arabi taught that the first step in awakening is not meditation, not prayer, not study. It's attention to breath, because the breath doesn't lie. It reveals what you're really feeling, what you're really holding, what you're really avoiding. When you're afraid, your breath tightens. When you're angry, it becomes sharp. When you're numb, it becomes so faint you barely notice it. And when you're present, when you're truly alive, the breath deepens. It softens. It becomes a wave that moves through you, carrying not just oxygen but awareness, presence, life itself. So here's a practice, though Ibn Arabi would probably hate that word. It's not a practice, it's a return. Sit somewhere quiet, not to meditate, not to achieve anything, but just to sit, close your eyes, and breathe. Not deep breaths, not controlled breaths, just natural breaths. And notice where the breath goes. Notice where it doesn't. Notice if there are parts of your body that feel closed off, numb, dead. Those are the places where the nafs has tightened its grip. Those are the places where the soul can't breathe. And don't try to fix it. Don't try to breathe into those places with force. Just notice. Just be with it. Because awareness itself is healing. Awareness itself is the beginning of release. And the soul, when it feels that you're finally paying attention, when it senses that you're no longer drowning it in noise and distraction, begins to move again, slowly, carefully, like something that's been in hiding for a long time and isn't sure it's safe yet. This is the path, not a path of doing, but a path of undoing. Not a path of becoming, but a path of unbecoming. Ibn Arabi said that most people spend their lives trying to add things, knowledge, virtue, power, status, enlightenment. But the soul doesn't awaken through addition, it awakens through subtraction. Through the gradual removal of everything that's false, everything that's borrowed, everything that was never yours to begin with. And this process is terrifying, because as the false self falls away, there's a period where you don't know who you are. You're no longer the person you were, but you haven't yet become whatever comes next. You're in the in-between, the barzakh, as Ibn Arabi called it, the liminal space between worlds. And in that space, there are no answers, no certainty, no identity to cling to, just raw presence, just the breath, just the quiet hum of something real that doesn't need to explain itself. Most people can't tolerate this space. They panic. They reach for anything to fill the void. They create a new identity, start a new project, find a new guru, adopt a new philosophy, anything to avoid the emptiness. But Ibn Arabi said the emptiness is not empty. It's full of potential, full of presence, full of the divine. It only feels empty because you're used to being full of yourself, full of your thoughts, your stories, your fears, your endless need to know and control. And when all of that is gone, when the nafs has finally exhausted itself, what remains feels like nothing. But it's not nothing, it's everything. This is baqa. Subsistence after annihilation, the state of being that exists when the illusion of separation dissolves. You're still here, you still have a body, a name, a life, but you're no longer trapped inside the story of yourself. You're no longer defending, proving, justifying. You're just here, present, alive, breathing. And from this place, everything changes. Not externally. Your life might look exactly the same. But internally, there's a freedom that can't be touched. A peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. A clarity that sees through the games people play, including the ones you used to play. You stop needing things to be different. You stop waiting for your life to start. You realize it's been happening all along and you were just too distracted by the nafs to notice. Ibn Arabi said that after fana, you begin to see God in everything. Not as a belief, not as a concept, but as a direct perception. You see the divine in the trees, in the sky, in the faces of strangers, in your own breath. You see that everything is a manifestation, a self-disclosure, a revelation. And you stop asking why, you stop needing meaning. Because existence itself is the meaning, life itself is the answer. But to get here, you have to be willing to die first. And not just once, over and over. Because the nafs is stubborn. It resurrects itself in new forms. It hides in spiritual concepts, in awakened identities, in subtle pride. And each time it does, you have to see it. You have to name it. You have to let it die again. This is why Ibn Arabi said that fana is not a single event. It's a process, a continuous surrender, a lifetime of letting go. And here's where most spiritual seekers get stuck. They taste fana once, through a retreat, a ceremony, a moment of grace, and they think they've arrived. They think they're done, but the nafs is patient. It waits. And when the seeker relaxes, when they stop paying attention, it creeps back in. More subtle this time, more refined. It dresses itself in spiritual language and enlightened concepts, and the seeker doesn't even realize they're back in the prison. The soul goes silent again. The deadness returns. But now it's harder to see because it's wrapped in the appearance of awakening. This is the trap. And Ibn Arabi warned about it constantly. He said that the greatest danger on the path is not ignorance, it's false knowing. It's the person who thinks they've awakened when they've only traded one illusion for another. The person who thinks they've transcended the ego when they've only made it more sophisticated. The person who talks about surrender but is still secretly in control. So how do you know if you're really awake? You don't. That's the sign. The person who knows they're awake is still asleep. The person who's truly awake doesn't think about it. They don't claim it. They don't perform it. They just live. And their life has a quality that's unmistakable. Presence. Not the performance of presence, not the spiritual aesthetic of mindfulness, but actual embodied breathing presence. You can feel it when you're around them. They don't take up space with their identity. They don't demand attention. They don't need to be seen or validated. They're just there, fully there. And in their presence, something in you relaxes, something remembers. This is what the soul recognizes. Not words, not concepts, not teachings, but presence. The presence of someone who has died and returned. Someone who has walked through fana and lived to tell not the story of it, but the silence of it. Because real awakening doesn't make you more talkative. It makes you more quiet. It doesn't make you more certain. It makes you more humble. It doesn't make you special. It makes you ordinary. But an ordinary that's luminous with life. Ibn Arabi lived this. He didn't just write about fana and baqa. He embodied them. He died to himself over and over, and each death revealed another layer of reality. And what he discovered was this: the soul never needed to be awakened. It was always awake. It was you, the constructed, defended, terrified you, that was asleep. And the moment you stop maintaining that fiction, the moment you stop holding yourself together, the soul doesn't awaken. It simply is. And you realize it's been there all along, breathing you, living you, waiting for you to notice. So if your soul feels dead, it's not. It's just buried. Buried under years of fear, performance, survival, and the relentless noise of a self that was never real. And the way to awaken it is not to search for it, not to fix it, not to become worthy of it. The way is to stop, to breathe, to let everything you think you are fall away, to die before you die. And in that death, in that terrifying, liberating collapse of everything false, the soul doesn't return. You return to it, and you realize you were never separate. You were never lost. You were never dead. You were just living in a story that convinced you otherwise. And now, finally, the story is over. And what remains is not an ending. It's a beginning. The beginning of a life lived from the soul instead of the mask. The beginning of a breath that's not gasped but given. The beginning of an existence that doesn't need to prove itself because it knows, in the quietest, deepest place, that it already is. This is what Ibn Arabi left behind. Not a religion, not a system, not a set of rules, but a map for the soul that's forgotten how to find itself. A reminder that the deadness you feel is not permanent, that the numbness is not who you are. That beneath the layers of self-protection and fear, there's something alive, something true, something that has been waiting your entire life for you to stop running and finally come home. And you don't come home by going anywhere. You come home by stopping, by breathing, by letting the false self die, by surrendering to the terrifying, beautiful truth that you are not who you think you are, and that what you really are doesn't need to be awakened. It just needs to be allowed. So allow it. Stop defending, stop performing, stop waiting for the right moment. The soul doesn't wait. It's here, now, in this breath, in this silence, in this quiet, unspoken presence that exists before thought, before fear, before identity. And the only question left is, are you willing to meet it? Not tomorrow, not when you're ready, not when you figured it all out, but now, right now, in the raw, unpolished, imperfect reality of this moment. Because the soul doesn't need perfection, it needs honesty. And if you can be honest, really honest, about how dead you feel, about how lost you are, about how much of your life has been a performance, then you're closer to awakening than anyone who pretends they have it all figured out. Because awakening doesn't start with knowing, it starts with not knowing. It starts with the admission that you've been living a lie. And in that admission, in that raw, vulnerable truth, the soul takes its first breath. Not a breath you force, not a breath you control, but a breath that breathes you, a breath that comes from the source of all life and returns to it with every exhale. And in that breath you remember. You remember what it was like before you learned to be afraid, before you learned to perform, before you learned that you had to be someone other than what you are. You remember the silence that existed before words, the presence that existed before identity, the life that existed before you tried to control it. And you realize this is what you've been searching for. Not enlightenment, not transcendence, not spiritual achievement, but this simple, ordinary, extraordinary experience of being alive without the weight of a self that needs to prove itself. This breath, this moment, this quiet recognition that you are not separate from the life that's living you. This is what Ibn Arabi meant when he said the soul awakens. Not that it gains something new, but that it remembers something old. Something so old it predates your birth. Something so fundamental it will outlast your death. Something that doesn't need your belief, your understanding, or your permission. It just needs your attention, your honesty, your willingness to let everything false fall away so what's real can finally breathe. And if you're still reading this, if you've made it this far, then something in you is ready. Not the nafs. The nafs will never be ready. But the soul. The soul is always ready. It's been ready since the moment you first felt that something was wrong, that something was missing, that you were living in a way that didn't match what you knew, deep down, was true. That feeling was not depression. It was not weakness. It was the soul's first whisper. Its first attempt to reach you through the noise of the nafs. And every moment of numbness, every moment of deadness, every moment you felt like you were going through the motions without actually living, those were not signs that you were broken. They were signs that you were ready to break open, because the soul doesn't awaken in comfort. It awakens in crisis. It awakens when the self you've been maintaining can no longer hold itself together. It awakens when you finally admit, I don't know who I am, I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't keep living like this. And in that admission, in that moment of total surrender, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. The silence becomes less suffocating. The emptiness becomes less terrifying. The not knowing becomes less like death and more like space. Space to breathe. Space to be. Space to exist without the constant pressure to become. And slowly in that space you begin to feel something you forgot was possible. Not happiness. Happiness is too small. Not peace. Peace is too passive. But aliveness. Raw, unfiltered, undefended aliveness. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind that exists simply because you exist. The kind that Ibn Arabi said is your birthright. The divine breath that animates your body, your heart, your soul. This is what awakens. Not a new you, but the real you, the one that was always there beneath the masks, beneath the fear, beneath the relentless performance of being someone you're not. And when that real you finally emerges, when the soul finally breathes without obstruction, you don't feel more spiritual. You don't feel enlightened, you just feel real. And real is enough. Real is everything.